Hi, and welcome to Tuesday Community Connections. I came across a story the other day that I heard long ago, and I've heard several times, and maybe some of you have heard it as well. But it's a great story, and I'd like to share it with you. It's about a little boy telling his mom what happened in Sunday school. 9-year-old Joey was asked by his mother what he had learned in Sunday school. Well, Mom, our teacher told us how God sent Moses behind enemy lines in a rescue mission to lead the Israelite people out of Egypt. When he got to the Red Sea, he had his army build a pontoon bridge and all the people walked across safely. Then he radioed headquarters for reinforcements. They sent bombers to blow up the bridge and all the Israelites were saved. Now, Joey, is that really what your teacher taught you? His mother asked. Well, no, Mom, but if I told it the way the teacher did, you'd never believe me. Have you heard that story before? And I mean, isn't that true? You look at some of these stories in the Bible, this one obviously, the crossing of the Red Sea, and it just is kind of an amazing story. I think, at least for me, sometimes what's easy to do is to put these stories of the Bible in kind of Bible perspective. That happened in the Bible. We live in real life, and so we just kind of leave them there. Yep, they're stories. They're nice stories. This little boy looked at that story and thought, nobody's going to believe this. This is just amazing. Couldn't happen this way. So when Mom asked what he learned in church school that day, he made up what he thought would be more logical. What would make more sense? Maybe, what would his mother believe? I think, though, we do that about stories. We kind of put them in that perspective of, well, that's just a Bible story. But I think we lose a lot when we do that. I mean, that story of the Red Sea is a story of God doing amazing things, bringing his people to safety, to freedom. Remember, they were slaves before this. And so he had released them from Egypt, but they came across the Red Sea and they had to get across it, and they were being pursued by the Egyptians. And God found a way. God made a way for that to happen. It's an amazing story, but that doesn't mean that it's not something that we ought to believe, or that we have to say, that's just a whole different kind of thing. That's what happens in the Bible, but not really. If you look at the Bible stories, though, some of them many of them, in fact, have amazing kinds of things going on in them, things that may at times even be hard to believe, but it tells us who God is, a God who does miraculous, even unbelievable things. Not always parting the Red Sea so that we can run across to safety, but giving us hope and giving us life and showing us the next step. Kind of amazing during some of the times and some of the things that we go through. I mean, let's look at some of the other Bible stories when you think about them. Let's put them in perspective. Abraham and Sarah. Abraham was promised that he would be the father of a mighty nation. Remember that? Look at the stars in the sky, God said. That'll be how many descendants you have. And remember, Abraham and Sarah believed, and they trusted, and they waited. And they waited. And they waited. And it was when Abram was 100 years old and Sarah was 90, and they still hadn't had even one child. But at that age, God made Sarah pregnant, and they had a child, Isaac, at 100 years old and 90 years old. And so maybe that story isn't so much about their ages as it is about God does miraculous, unbelievable things. Or think about Hannah. Remember Hannah was married to Elkanah, and she too, when her husband would come every year to the temple, would pray and pray for a child. And finally, she had a child, Samuel. And she promised if she did, she would give this child to the priest to serve God that way. And so when he was barely old enough to be on his own, she brought him back to the temple, gave him to Eli the priest, and said, "This is the child I prayed for. This is the child I have. His mission is to serve God." And so Samuel, this child that was prayed for, served that priest, became a prophet and a leader, became known throughout all of Israel. I mean, from this little boy who was prayed for by a mother who wanted desperately to have a child, and then amazingly she gave that child back to God. And look what happened. Or look at the birth of Jesus. I mean, people were waiting for a Savior, and they were waiting for a mighty king. They were waiting for somebody strong, and they were waiting for another David, King David. But instead, Jesus was born to a peasant couple, a teenager, Mary, and her husband, Joseph, sent to another town, to Bethlehem, to register, and Jesus was born in the middle of no fanfare. Nobody knew. It wasn't a big deal at all. And here's the Messiah of the world. I mean, that's an amazing story. And if you think about it, would that really happen today? I mean, we would be waiting and we would be looking and we would have TV cameras and everything else around, wouldn't we? And look at Jesus' ministry. I mean, all that he did. Think about the blind man that he healed, that he put mud on his eyes and touched him and prayed and he received his sight. I mean, that's a miracle. And you and I can kind of put that in perspective and say, well, that happened when Jesus was here. But what that story is telling us is that God does amazing things. God does miraculous things. We don't always receive our sight when we're blind, but that God can do amazing and miraculous things. Or the feeding of the 5,000 with 5 loaves and 2 fish. A story that tells us that if we give what we have, even though it's just a little bit, a lunch for a small boy, that God can use what we give and feed hundreds of people. Or God can use what we give, and what we give will be blessed and multiplied and nourish amazing people. The stories in the Bible are incredible kinds of stories, and if you think of them logically, you have to shake your head and think, nobody's ever going to believe this. I mean, this just doesn't happen today. But if you look at the bigger picture and kind of behind the story, what we see in these stories is a God who is present, who hasn't left. A God who comes in times of great challenge and great need and is there, whether it's to cross the Red Sea or to receive sight again or to be fed with bread and fish. God is where we are. These stories also tell us that God provides no matter what. That when our backs are against the wall and there just doesn't seem to be another way, God provides. These stories of the Bible are stories of faith, stories of our ancestors in the faith, stories of people who encountered God in amazing ways and then followed God in faith. They knew God's presence. They knew God called and worked through them. And so they responded. And miracles often happened. Amazing things took place. People's needs were taken care of. That's what the Bible is really all about. It's not so much about the details of whether it was 5 loaves and 2 fish or 6 loaves and 3 fish or whatever it might be. These stories tell us about a God who cares about people. They tell you and me about our forebears and faith and how their faith was strengthened and how God was with them even in the most terrible times and giving them blessings and all they need. These are our stories as well. And we don't write down our stories of faith the way they did after Bible times to keep those stories alive, but we've all got stories of faith, don't we? I mean, if you think about it, think about when God was there, whether it was in a quiet way or a big and loud way. Think about a prayer that was answered, whether in the way you wanted it and prayed for it or a way that brought you what you need. God is with us, even today. Maybe we should say, especially today, blessing us with His presence, reminding us that we're not alone, working through our everyday lives, and showing us that He is there and that He cares. And so these Bible stories are amazing, sometimes unbelievable. But I'm guessing if we looked at our faith stories, stories of God in our lives, and if we listened to other people's stories of God in their lives, we would be amazed then as well at what God can and does do in our lives every day. So I challenge you, look around. Where do you see God? Look at today and yesterday and maybe last week or last year. Where do you see a story of God doing amazing and sometimes even miraculous things in your life? And in those times when you're in need, or when you're in question, or when you're not quite sure what to do next, remember, God is there. God brings His presence with wherever you go and is always with you, and that God does answer our prayers. So God bless you as you live your story of faith, a story that's added to the stories of the Bible, showing God's presence and God's love for us always. Have a good week, and we'll see you next Tuesday.